Hello, everybody. Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed your lunch. We are being joined by our friends online. So I will again acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respect to elders past and present and any joining us here today. And note that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are joined here today by Miranda Stewart. Miranda Stewart is a professor specialising in taxation law at the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne, where we are right now. She's also an honorary professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Now, following our Community Tax Summit in February and Miranda's incredibly popular keynote speech, we wanted to have her back to provide a bit of a follow-up address outlining some how the Australian tax system came about today, the reasons that it needs reform, and what we can expect moving forward. This, of course, all in the context of the recently announced Productivity Roundtable, which will be taking submissions and listening to reform ideas that have to do with tax. This is something that came out of the Per Capita Community Tax Summit. I'm really pleased that we are having this more national conversation and that over the next term of government we can start to build some policies that will set us up for a more equitable future. So could you please join me in welcoming Professor Miranda Stewart. So just get you to tap. Okay. Yeah, you're on.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, people can hear me all right. People online can hear me. So thanks very much to Sarah and Meredith and to Per Capita for inviting me back, and to all of you for giving up your lunch. Well, I hope you're enjoying lunch. Just free to talk about this riveting topic. And I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which Melbourne University is based, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects. So what did I was kind of like, well, I could just redo my Community Tax Summit lecture, but maybe that's not the best use of this time. I think there are some people in this room who've been thinking about these issues for quite a while too, so I'm very interested in people's questions as well, and we can allow enough time for that. I thought it might be useful just to say a couple of things about history. I just love history, really, and the history of Australia's tax system, and then what I see as some of the key issues and challenges and perhaps misconceptions in the current, in sort of tax debate. And then, well, possibly what could be on the table this year, and perhaps what it means to have tax framed in the context of a productivity roundtable, and that being the framing of this debate rather than other things about tax. So I'm sure many of you know Federation was 1901 in Australia. And of course we had the colonies before then, and of course we had 60,000 years of Indigenous governance and participation on this land before then, without a tax system as we currently recognise it. Taxes, of course, are kind of the main financing of government these days. In Australia, like many other OECD countries, we finance more than 80%, closer to 90% of our expenditures with taxes of different kinds. The balance, of course, is other forms of government revenue, fees, penalties, some state-owned enterprise revenue, and debt. But it hasn't always been that way, and there's potentially an issue that it may not be that way in the future. So one thing, if we're trying to focus in on a tax reform debate today, one thing that would be good to keep in mind is what is the role of taxes in the context of these various ways of financing government. When Australia became a federation, the tax level as a share of GDP was only about 5%. The expenditure level was about 10% of GDP. So the difference was financed with debt and not many other, a little bit of revenue from actual government-owned resources, I suppose. But we had a very small state at the Commonwealth level, but also at colonial levels. We were pretty poor. I mean, we were rich in the sense of our resources from the beginning, I guess, relative to other the countries that we had come from as migrants, but a pretty poor state, and our taxes were pretty slim and inadequate and pragmatic. I think it's still the case that tax systems have to be pragmatic, but what a pragmatic tax system looks like today is very different from what it looked like a century ago. I should just say something briefly about the slides. They've been distributed, and if people are interested, I can always give you more resources. I've got plenty of them. I'll go through the slides a little bit, but I probably won't highlight them too much. So I noticed we just sort of went on to that budget fundamentals, but I thought I might, well, we can leave it. Yeah, we can leave it there. So this is the slide that is talking about the current tax level as a share of GDP from the most recent budget. So yes, in 1901, we essentially had 5% of GDP in taxes, and those taxes were almost exclusively customs and excise. And the states, the colonies, had a little bit of income tax and a little bit of land tax and some wealth tax. But pretty soon afterwards, the Commonwealth needed revenue. Now, one of the interesting debates in sort of tax history and sort of political analysis is what drives governments, what drives peoples to establish more taxes, to build up tax revenue. That is to build this kind of collective use of resources or system of collecting resources. A common argument is that it's war that drives, increased taxation. And certainly when you look at the timing of the Commonwealth tax base increases a century ago, we had World War I, obviously, sort of 1911 to 1915. The first Commonwealth income tax is 1915. The Commonwealth land tax was 1912, and the Commonwealth estate and gift tax, which we no longer have, the Commonwealth inheritance was also 1912. But the other thing that drives tax collection, I suspect what happens is that the crisis, the national crisis or emergency of war or potentially some other crisis focuses the mind, you might say, of politicians who might need to be financing these massive new expenditures for national security, say. But it's not actually what delivers tax reform. I think what delivers the social consent for that reform is actually a social belief that the government will deliver public goods and services that the people want. And that, national security is kind of like, well, that's the minimum, right, that people demand of their government is national security, and we'll give our lives and whatever money is required for that, potentially. But that's a very short-term thing, not really sustainable in the longer term. So the bigger driver really for all those new taxes 100 years ago was actually the desire for the age pension, which had been a key social and political and labour union factor of driving federation itself, was that the states could not equally deliver a pension to retiring workers. And, we've lost that there, maybe it doesn't matter. And it just needed a new tax system to achieve that. And so we had the federal age pension and also child allowances, family endowment, child endowment in 1912. as well. So before Federation, New South Wales and Victoria had begun to introduce a pension, but the other states the other colonies could not afford it. And so we were going to have inequality across the nation, or across the sort of different colonies on the continent, as well as within the colonies. So that drive for sort of social provision, public provision, and kind of equity, fairness across the whole nation, I think, is what sustained that tax reform drive. And the evidence, the other interesting thing about that, and I will come up to the contemporary era very soon, but the other interesting thing about the World War I era is that it would appear that most of the tax revenue wasn't spent on the war. In any event, it was mostly spent on building public infrastructure. And to the extent that Australia had wartime expenditures, they were mainly financed by imperial debt borrowing from Great Britain, from the Empire. And there's evidence at that time that Britain got annoyed with Australia for spending the debt on not only paying for a bit of the war stuff, but actually on building public infrastructure in Australia. And that was actually part of the quid pro quo of Australia's participation in the war, was that actually we would get that debt to build infrastructure in Australia, that it was nation building. So the other thing we need that revenue and debt for is nation building, physical infrastructure needed for a good society. So if we jump more than 100 years later, or it's not much more than 100 years later, 110 years later, what is the tax system doing for us today, and what might tax reform do? So our tax to GDP ratio, tax level for the nation as a whole, there's this the most recent budget. This is the Commonwealth, 23.5% of GDP, that's just the Commonwealth. Relatively low in the OECD. The Commonwealth revenue ratio, so just to give you an idea of the size of the state, so taxes, 23.5% of GDP. As GDP grows, which we would like to happen, productivity and economic growth revenues do grow as well. Oh, we keep losing that on the screen there. The revenue ratio means that all the other revenues as well, we add them in, fines, penalties, dividends from Telstra. We have a ratio of 25.5% of GDP, so add another 2%. Our expenditure, however, at the Commonwealth level is 27.4% of GDP. So the difference is financed with debt. If we look at all states and local as well as federal, taxes are actually 29, close to 30% of GDP. So still below the OECD ratio. I think it's very clear, and many people have said it, that we are not covering our costs. Now, debt is sustainable in the long term because we have a good tax system. So we can keep raising revenues and we can keep servicing debt. These two are sort of symbiotic. But I think we do have this kind of trajectory of sustained negatives. Maybe we'll get back to balance on lots of fixed assumptions in a decade, but it seems unlikely, to be honest. And it also relies on revenues continuing to go up, that is economic growth continuing to go up and revenue collections going up, so no indexation of tax brackets, and payments staying flat. That's what would deliver us this apparent fiscal balance in a decade. This is also from that budget. Some of our very biggest expenditure areas are rapidly growing. This is the growth rate of expenditure in some of these big areas, including childcare, medical, hospitals, defence. I think it's pretty clear we're in an era not of war, but of increased defence expenditure. And you can see interest expense. Interest rates have gone up, and as debt goes up. And certainly at the state level, debt is at its highest it's been for a long time. There's no direct control of that yet, but the Commonwealth is also paying more interest. So look, I think in this context, it's going to be necessary to increase tax levels. So what I want to, the first kind of principle, if you like, if you think about tax reform then though, is that there's often a misconception or a confusion that increasing tax level as a share of the economy is the same thing as increasing tax rates. So the two things are not necessarily the same, are not the same, and the one may not necessarily require the other. And the other thing is the idea that somehow higher levels of tax as a share of the economy as a whole is bad for economic growth or is a negative, would be a problem. So I think it's a social and political decision and a decision about Australia's national security and our well-being, whether we want more revenue, that is, whether we want to share using taxes a little bit more in collective decision making for public goods and services and social security. And we can also have economic growth, right? The two are not mutually exclusive. So if we then go on and think about the tax system itself as a whole, just to highlight that this is from the budget. This is my own little pie chart that I put together, but it comes from the budget statement. This is the Commonwealth system, of course. So states have, land tax, stamp duty, payroll taxes, a few other levies. What you can see there is the individual income tax is the grey, more than half of Commonwealth revenue. The company income tax is orange, and the green slice there is taxes that superannuation funds pay. So income tax is 3/4 of Commonwealth revenue, and it's more than 60% of total tax revenue. So the second misconception or issue I wanted to highlight is that in any tax reform debate, the idea that we might somehow make income tax not a thing, like that somehow income tax can be drained away or can be replaced with something else, or even that there should be any kind of switch between a income tax base and a consumption tax base is misguided, right? Is actually impossible if we want to achieve some of the same revenue and equity goals that we achieve in the system that we have today. A radical change of that part of the tax system implies a radical change in kind of the nation, in a way. Maybe that's what people want, but which is not to say you can't reform the income tax. So you can, and it's also not to say that you might not want more GST revenue, for example. So the GST, you can see that essentially our consumption tax base is that top quarter of the pie chart, the top left quarter, the GST, and then we've got alcohol, tobacco and fuel excise and customs and tariffs, which are very small. I don't recommend following the US and just ratcheting up the tariffs. It won't do anything for either the economy or revenue. But GST raises only 13% of tax revenues. It's really surprisingly small for the amount of talk we do about the GST. And in my view, it doesn't do enough work. The GST potentially is a good revenue raiser. Most other comparable countries raise more revenue from that base. So there are different ways for us to think about doing it. I wouldn't really be talking about a GST income tax switch though, because I think we need a little bit more revenue. So I'd be reforming the income tax and potentially also increasing the GST a bit in order to give us that fiscal sustainability. Okay, so let me say a little bit then about sort of key challenges and what I see some of the key elements are of sort of thinking about tax reform today. I guess the first thing is that I would emphasise that along with this revenue raising I do think our principles of fairness in the tax system, of tax more or less on the basis of ability to pay, thought of across the system as a whole, are important. Quite a few of our taxes are not progressive, right? That is, they're not on the basis of ability to pay. Our GST is probably neutral or a little bit regressive, but because we exempt a lot of things from it, in particular food, that assists in progressivity of the GST. Excises are quite regressive, fuel, alcohol, tobacco. They're flat rates, but they also apply more heavily on low-income households as a share of their income. But the income tax is progressive, right? The individual income tax, probably the company income tax as well, delivers progressivity because they tax capital income and gains at a certain kind of level. When you add in stamp duties, land taxes, they also add some progressivity to the system because, of course, people with assets pay those taxes and people without assets don't. But nonetheless, the most progressive tax is the income tax, and we rely on it to deliver that ability to pay. So we want to be careful when we're thinking about tax reform not to undermine that progressive rate structure, because that rate structure is what is delivering fairness, ability to pay in the system as a whole, right? It's kind of doing that work. We want our taxes to be simple and certain and easy to collect and administer and all of those things. And there's lots of opportunities to improve those sorts of things. I won't focus on that sort of thing now. But I do think the other key reason for tax reform, and this, I quite like the Productivity Roundtable framing in a way, I do think that just raising more revenue is not a good enough reason for tax reform. If that really was our only goal, we could just let the income tax rate structure just do its work over the next 5 to 10 years, not index anything, not change the thresholds, not change the rates, and wage earners will keep paying more tax, right? Because that's what happens in the income tax. Wage earners pay the bulk of it, and they will face higher rates. So what I would be looking for then is some kind of reform in the income tax to make sure that, I've lost the presentation on my slide here, I'm afraid it's gone. Some kind of reform in the income tax to make sure that wage earners don't face too high tax rates over the coming years and decades, and that the owners of capital and those earning capital income and gain pay a bit more. So I'd be looking for reform within the income tax system, as well perhaps as other things, right? But within the income tax. So which wage earners are paying tax rates that are maybe too high or become too high over time, right, if we don't index those brackets? Or I don't really recommend indexing the brackets, but if people have it, we can discuss it. But wage earners do pay more because so which wage earners in particular? I do think that moderate wage earners sort of, if you think of average wages, I don't know, the average is not a great indicator, but it's around about 85 to 90,000 a year, I think, is where average wages sit. The median wage is around about 65. Someone in this room probably knows better than me. So what we call the average effective tax rate on the average wage earner in Australia is around about 25%. So that's kind of the tax they pay as a share of their income, the total tax they pay. That seems all right to me, but I'd be a bit worried if that was 30 or 35 or 40%, right? So we need to make sure that average wage earners have substantial disposable income, private income, after that tax. So we don't want that to get any higher. And if we don't do something about rebalancing the income tax, it will get higher, that tax rate on the average wage earner. And certainly moderate earners pay an average tax rate of a bit lower. So how can we do that? Well, one solution is just to keep ratcheting up the brackets in a way, changing the bracket, changing the thresholds. But if you do that, you also tax people with capital income and gain you give them that benefit as well, right? Rather than just giving wage earners that benefit. So I think we need to think more carefully about how we tax labour income, people doing work, and people with active businesses, and how we tax savings investment. So one solution is to broaden that tax base, reduce the capital gains concessions that we have in the system, and perhaps to deliver some sort of a tax cut to those facing the highest effective tax rates, which are actually families with children where the parents are working, right? So they're facing that 25% effective tax rate in the tax system. They also have the costs of children, and those costs are very high. We don't provide too much. We do provide childcare subsidies, but we means test those childcare subsidies. We don't provide family payments these days, only go to the bottom sort of 45% of kids, don't go to most families. And we have these very high effective tax rates on the labour income of second earners, in particular in the household. So I would be keen on sort of somehow delivering a lower tax rate to dual earner families with kids. We could do that maybe in the tax system, but we could probably do it in the transfer system. So the tax transfer system really needs to be thought of together. Family payments are really part of the tax system, and we could reform those to deliver that lower tax rate. And on the other hand, we could reduce that capital gains discount or treat capital gain, net of inflation perhaps, just like all other income. And I would want to tax superannuation a bit more, and I'm happy to explain my view on that excess super balance 3 million tax if anyone's interested in that. I think that's a good policy proposal. It's not enough, but I think it's a good proposal. I would also be keen on reintroducing an inheritance or estate tax in Australia. I think there's a lot of debate to be had about an appropriate threshold, about whether the main residence should be excluded, about the design of such a tax, the rate of such a tax. But when I look at how much wealth we now have in Australia, which is not in the tax base, right, which is not really paying, maybe stamp duty's been paid on it once, maybe there's a little bit of land tax, but we're not really capturing sort of the benefits of the last 40 years of economic growth and asset price increases. And then we're going to have another 20 years of bequests. If we introduced an estate and gift tax, we would also, I think, encourage philanthropy, which is moderately okay in Australia, but not very generous, really. And if we introduced a well-designed estate and gift tax applicable from now on, then the next 20 or 30 years, I think, could see the establishment of really, really substantial private contribution to the public good, as well as through the tax system. The final thing I'll say, and I'm conscious of time, so I sort of want to stop and just sort of answer questions, is to go back to look at this company income tax piece of the puzzle here. So you can see it's pretty important. It's nearly a quarter of Commonwealth tax revenue comes from the company income tax. It keeps going off on the screen. So, of course, that company income tax operates as a backup to the personal income tax, right? So if people are earning business or investment income and they use an entity structure, they have that 30% company tax rate or 25%, at least we collect some tax from the entity, even if the income hasn't come into the individual's own hands. So that's a very important function of the company tax. People will know that the company tax interacts with our income tax through the franking credit system, right? Through franked dividends and what we call imputation, where we give that credit for the company tax to the individual shareholder. There are some good reasons we have an imputation credit system, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend abolishing it, But I do think that that system has produced unintended outcomes in Australia, and I would be looking to somehow reduce the overtime benefit of franking credits. Perhaps by just reducing them over time, so that if you didn't distribute your dividends straight away, you waited a few years, the credit is worth less or something. Taper it out over time. Something that would encourage distribution in a timely way and prevent gaming the system. The other work that the company income tax does is it taxes foreign investment into Australia, and foreign investors, that's a very important function of the tax, and it taxes our resources, banking and supermarket sector, which are the ones with monopolies and quasi-monopolies in Australia's economy. So we want to keep collecting revenue from them, but we do have this kind of missing middle in Australian business, it seems to me. We've got and this might be where the Productivity Roundtable can do some thinking, and the Productivity Commission is as well. We don't have much advanced manufacturing. We don't have much in the way of tech businesses. We don't have much that's kind of businesses worth 100 million as opposed to 10 million or 10 billion, right? There's not much in the middle, and there's not much in diversified. So there's an argument for reducing company tax in a way that would encourage that kind of investment in Australia, I think. Designing that is not that easy, and there's different ways to go about it. Okay, so why should we do tax reform? We should do it because we do need a bit more sustainability and a bit more revenue, but we should really do it because we want to make sure that we can reorient the tax system to manage this new economy, to manage this new kind of active business investment we want, and labour income, working, support workers in the system. And to achieve that, we can tax capital income and gain and wealth a bit more without harming anyone, really, in order to achieve the revenue that we need. And I have faith that this will happen over the next 3 years. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to answer questions or comments about that, Sarah.
Thank you. So thank you very much.
So I didn't use the slides at all, really, but they're there as a resource if people want.
Yes, and they're on the table, and they should be in your emails. So we have a roaming mic. We use it because we've got people joining us online. So if you pop your hand up, Meredith will do around the room, but we'll see if there's anybody over here that is looking to ask a question. No? Yes, here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I spent 20 years in Sweden and saw a tax system which was progressive in all relation to inequality and so forth. I've looked, since I moved to Australia in 1998, I've seen the inequality in the tax system grow, which you pointed out in some of those discussions. I suppose my big question is, could we adopt the Swedish model of the tax system? I could go on for about half an hour about what that means in terms of all sorts of benefits, from subsidies to parents to be able to stay home with the children for 18 months. I could go on for a long time. Do you think the Swedish model could be something that we could use in Australia for tax reform? Thank you.
Thank you. So I've put on the slide, the comparison. This is the tax level. That is the tax as a share of the economy, as a share of GDP in the OECD. So Australia is the red bar. That's our sort of 29% of GDP. That's all levels of government. Sweden is on the left, where there are higher bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's about the 6th or 7th in. You probably can't really see it very well. It's got a tax level of about 42% of GDP. So there's I've got a couple of comments to make about that. I mean, Nordic states, not just them, but certainly Denmark, all of them really sit up there. Norway's a bit different because it has a big resource base. One of the things about their systems is that they have a very high tax level. That is, they bring a lot of market resource, right, that economic return, into government decision-making, into that collective decision-making framework using the tax law, right? They sort of harness that into public goods and services, as you say, and that means they deliver not only a year and a half at home with the kid, which is really, in my view, probably pretty important. I'm a massive fan of childcare, but maybe in 0 to 12 months, there's another way we could do that work. They also deliver free university education, so all the way. So if you're thinking about investment in the people, you can afford that if you have that higher amount of revenue. Their tax system, though, it's very interesting, right? So their tax law is not particularly progressive. So they collect a lot of revenue, and they do collect more revenue from capital income and gain than we do. And they collect a lot more revenue from value-added tax, VAT, probably 3 times the share of revenue that we collect from the GST they would collect. So, and they have social security contributions as well, which is essentially a tax on labour income, whereas we rely on the income tax for that. So they collect a lot more, but they also deliver, of course, a lot more in public goods and services, and they have a kind of consent, political consent to that. So what is it about Australia that puts us next to the United States in our tax level as a share of GDP instead of next to the Nordic countries? What is it about our fiscal compact, right? Our government consent structure that means we're much more in this smaller government, and we see it in all our service delivery, privatised, hybrid delivery, private delivery of services and goods as well as public, right? That's kind of how our economy and our government work. I would be a fan of shifting a bit towards the Scandinavian model, but for some, it's a puzzle, right? If there are people in this room who think that's a good idea, what is it about the Australian nation that means we haven't done that yet? Why didn't we do it 50 years ago? We didn't. So anyway, but the tax law, it is progressive, but it's not as progressive as you might think. It's the service delivery that achieves the equality outcomes in the Scandinavian states.
Another questions? Yes, let's go to the side of this table. There's a man in a white shirt. Sorry, I don't know your name yet. But tell us your name and ask your question. No, we'll go this way.
Thank you. My name is Tim Howell from Prosper Australia. Thanks very much
Hi.
for the talk.
We've met, I think. I know, and I'm a fan of the land tax, but not of the single tax. We could, so.
I'm curious to get your views about a sort of reframing of the challenge in tax reform. And as you laid out, it's often described that you can derive income from your labour or from your savings and investment. And we end up with quite mixed views about the right way to tax savings and investment income. Should it be higher because that's held by the rich, or lower because that's coming from productive activity? I'm wondering what you think of the framing that's not so much the source of your savings and investment income, but the activity that generates that income. In particular, distinguishing between income coming from productive investment, entrepreneurship, investment in true structures, versus income from investing or really saving in assets that rise in value. And it strikes me that we can, in our tax settings, distinguish between income from those sources by, for example, taxing capital gains on real estate higher than capital gains on business. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that framing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of active business income or active work earnings, it still has a lot of resonance, doesn't it? The work that we do. And the creativity that we have. And in a way, when I'm talking about the missing middle in Australia's business economy, it is about innovation and that kind of active business in some way, and increasing productivity of Australian businesses more generally. So, historically, 100 years ago, we taxed labour income lower than capital income. So active, lower than passive. Now we reverse it. And we reversed it because of globalisation, because of a theory and probably evidence that capital investment is mobile. I'm not so sure now that that's true. I think we understand that actually Australia is a rather desirable place in the world today, both to live and to invest and to own assets. And so we can tax those assets and that passive income more highly, including land, without worrying that capital is going to flee, or that we need to understand we're operating in a different world now, and that so my rebalancing, I've used sort of capital income and labour income, but it's kind of what you're talking about, lifting tax on active business and active earnings and increasing it on what I would call investment or assets or wealth. Yeah.
Meredith, could we just go down to this table, please? Just here. Is this?
Yep. Right here.
And then.
My name's Russell Byer. Now, I think you're illustrating that the devising of taxation system generally that achieves such goals as raising sufficient revenue and doing it equitably and fairly is not so, it's easier said than done. That there are complexities about it. But even if you've done that, you've got a terrible problem, and that's called politics. So the real problem is how can tax reform actually be achieved if the scheme is devised? Because we've had some terrible illustrations. Many people in this room will remember occasions when modest tax proposals have been used to smash a government or smash an opposition. And I guess that the Bill Shorten experience is not a bad example of it.
Yeah.
Where a well thought out and sensible policy led to the defeat of an undefeatable opposition.
Yes, well, and that's happened in the past. Well, the GST, it was never going to happen as well. So you're right, politics is a huge challenge. But so tax is inevitably political, and that's also its great advantage. Okay, it seems like a massive disadvantage. How could we possibly reform? Supposedly I'm an expert, right? Not to blow my own trumpet. We don't want government by experts, right? The whole point is that we have a popular debate, that we have the populace making decisions, because the populace has to comply. We can't. What you can see in the US is that the rule of law is fragile, okay? So even if we got stuff into the law, if the populace doesn't want to do it, somehow the experts, it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to. So I guess I'm kind of a believer, you just got to double down on the politics of taxation. You're like, okay, this is political. Let's make a decision, people. What is it you actually want this country to look like? And so I guess I can keep saying now, I think we should have an inheritance tax. Jim Chalmers may not want to say that. That's all right, I can say it, and we can sort of have the debate. But to be honest, I think the super tax, I'm very worried about the Greens in the Senate. I hope that tax does not get watered down. That's actually a very effective wealth tax, and it is undoing a political mistake of 2006 when the caps were lifted on contributions to superannuation, right? A policy mistake of a previous era. That's what that tax is fixing. So I feel it's not a great answer, but I just think you have to you have to go embrace the politics of it and just keep working away at that politics.
To change the thinking of the nation.
Yeah, that's what's required, right? That's what's required. Yeah, it's not just an expert saying, well, franking credits have their downsides. Well, I agree with that, but, just taking that without bringing the people with you, that's the problem. And it's not easy, of course. I'm just an academic. So.
All right, we have a question over here.
Great to see you again, Professor.
Thank
Craig
you.
Malcolm, founding chairman of South Coast Community United Unions. Tremendous to sit here beside comrades from Prosper. At the Transparency Summit, actually this started in 2008 when British Gas tried to take over Origin Energy for $13 billion. And then there was John Robinson and myself, which had to take down Yammer. And here we are again today. We've Brookfield was a takeover of, I had to draw their attention to the ACCC. This is a common kind of fact. They said, excuse me. I said, no, you're not excused. I need the ACCC, ASIC, and a foreign investment all at once so you can get educated. All these years later, from 2008, only $7 billion, 20 billion for Origin, but we stopped that. Comrade Combe, who's now holding the purse strings of the Future Fund, stepped up to the plate. Now, what's going on with Santos?
Now, what's our tax question?
Yes.
Okay, well, foreign tax, okay, there is over 107 billion per annum to be picked up. Easy. Now, they're chopping up Santos, and everyone was bashing up Woodside to take over Santos. I'd like to draw everyone's attention. Santos took over Oil Search, which was paying 47% of Papua New Guinea's tax.
Comrade, we've got a couple more and we're going to wrap up soon. Let's do
foreign
questions.
tax, is a key fundamental.
So you're right. I didn't talk about it much. I did talk about company income tax being the tax that applies to foreign investment. So, you know, I don't know if you've been reading the news at all about the US withdrawing from global multilateral negotiations about tax. I read these stories, possibly you don't, but you know, I'll forgive you if you missed them. Enacting revenge taxes as well as tariffs on other countries, on people from other countries, if other countries try to establish a minimum tax on global multinationals. I think Australia, I don't know, we have a tendency to be very into multilateralism, and that's generally a good thing. You know, we're right in there, we're in the OECD, we're participating closely with all these tax cooperative efforts. We have legislated that global minimum tax. We were among the first countries to legislate it. If the new US bill essentially means we can't apply a part of that minimum tax to US companies without getting some kind of revenge tax on our businesses. So we're in a difficult spot, but I think you just have to keep going with the multilateralism whilst also perhaps being a little more, maybe sometimes being a bit more cautious about when Australia takes steps to join multilateral ventures. Just take a bit more care. But we can apply transfer pricing and rules and other rules to try to collect more revenue from large corporates. You're absolutely right about that, especially our mining companies, which are extracting renewable resources. I think in terms of the revenue challenge, I know it seems like there's a lot of money there. I'm not sure there's as much as people think. So even if we work really hard to apply those rules to get a bit more, it's actually our local wealth holders. It's our population of 26 million, of which there are 2 million millionaires. That's the latest data, 2 million millionaires. And we know it's all just the home, right, mainly. The home and superannuation savings. That's why we're rich. But that's a lot of millionaires, right, in the population as a whole. There's a lot of wealth. There's especially a lot of wealth in the top 1%. Jamie and I were talking about that. And we can collect quite a bit more revenue just from our domestic wealth, as well as continuing to push the global multinational agenda.
We'll just take a couple more. So we'll have one down here and then Virginia and then any others come in.
Hi, Alison McCullough.
Hi,
Thanks,
Alison.
Miranda, for your talk. I want to talk about a couple of things. I'll ask you questions about a couple of things. First of all, about the community support for taxation. It seems to me that we might have an opportunity now with a Prime Minister who said that his aim is to have government services to the level that people understand that governments can deliver.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we want to do that, we're going to have revenue. So maybe there's an opportunity, I don't know, for a conversation there. Your view about that, but also about your inheritance tax idea, which, having been an advocate for tax for many years, I'd be very surprised if there was any prospect. So if there's not, what's the next best thing there for taxing the assets of those that are going to give inheritance before they die?
Yeah.
Super being important. And also that issue about the tax system being geared to the older people benefiting and the younger people not, and you haven't really talked about that.
Well, I'm talking about wage earners and investors. You're right, there's an age thing there for sure.
Anyway,
Yeah, no, thanks, Alison. That's exactly right. So, well, the fiscal compact, I don't know. I mean, this latest scandal about paedophilia in childcare centres is horrifying, isn't it? And you sort of worry that that means people feel that they want to withdraw from these public systems. They worry about the social delivery of services. But actually, I think what we need to do is understand that if we put better resources into our schools, right, and our childcare systems and our health services, that we actually can deliver higher quality outcomes for everyone, and that sort of security and trust. So you need that sort of trust of the community in government services. And of course, many of those services are actually for-profit private services that are using government subsidies. So the tax revenue that supports these expenditures also needs to be, we need appropriate regulation of the delivery of those goods and services as well. I think there is an opportunity there. I'm a little worried in the productivity context because, you know, so one of the industry groups just sort of came out and said, oh, somehow productivity stats are down because we're delivering more aged care services. You know, we've got more government employees delivering services, which we need, and because the productivity is all about the person to capital investment ratio. So we have more people delivering services, so productivity looks worse. But yet we're actually delivering more services to people. So I think we need to be clear about that narrative, that actually this is good for society, these kinds of government services. I hope I'm encouraged by the fiscal sustainability narrative on taxing inheritance and wealth. So, yep, the super excess balance tax will do some work. We could tax superannuation a bit better on death. There is quite a lot of death benefit tax planning now happening. We should reform the taxation of trusts, discretionary trusts or holding assets sort of in perpetuity. Well-advised grandparents are setting up testamentary trusts for their children and getting access to essentially zero tax rates for their children for distributions of income every year, private school fees, and so on. And we can use land taxes, of course. So there's a chunk of that asset base which is in land. We collect quite, when you look at the stats in the OECD, we look quite high for property taxes relative to other countries. That's, of course, mostly stamp duty and a bit of land tax. The reason we look high is because we kind of are a homeowner society. Lots of people own a home, so then there is a bit of stamp duty collected, and that makes the stats look high. We still don't really collect a great deal of land. There's a lot of complaining in Victoria about land tax on holiday homes at the moment, but we still are not really collecting a very large share from land, and so doing more of that would get some of the wealth base. But the reason I like an estate tax is that it would actually capture that other equity investment, right, that private high wealth investment, which is not in someone's super fund and not in their home, right, which is that other investment. And there's a lot of wealth in that category that we should be taxing, I think. I've forgotten the last bit of the question, Alison. Was that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, look, you're right, of course. So, older people own assets, young people don't. Right? It's partly because you save and accumulate assets over the life course, and that's perfectly predictable. It's, I think, the intergenerational debate stuff is important. So when I talk about moderate wage earners, that tends to be younger workers, right? The median wage is below the average, but sometimes it's older workers who are just not earning a very high wage, right? Older aged care workers, they're still also on the median, right? So I get a bit worried about just talking about old and young, and when it's actually the top 20% of the 75 plus who have assets, or the top 30%. And in fact, although when you talk about inheritance, Australia does have a wealth tax. It's called the age pension asset test. That's a wealth tax. It's a wealth tax on the bottom 60% of the population. We don't tax the wealth of the top 30% of the population. We tax the wealth of the bottom 60 or 70% of the population by means testing the age pension. You know, it's perverse, right? So I'm more concerned about, I'd rather talk about the top 20 or 30% by income or wealth, who, you know, if it's by wealth, they're older than younger, rather than just making it an age debate. except that that's quite good politics, talking about young people. So conscious of
We'll
time,
squeeze
Sarah,
in just one
sorry.
more. Virginia, if you can do a quick fire question.
Hi, Virginia Wills.
Just wait for the mic though for our friends online.
Yeah.
Virginia Wills. I'm a sessional law lecturer at RMIT, but I'm the chair of the Council for Single Mothers and Their Children. Housing is a real issue for single parents and many, many others. I noticed the Productivity Roundtable has gone through a few name changes and it's now the Economic Reform.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Sorry, it's the Economic Reform
Still have
Roundtable.
work to do.
Yeah.
The question is, how can we get the tax system working to solve the housing crisis?
So, I mean, the biggest challenge is not enough public housing, right? That's one element, and that's the public expenditure question. So, you know, we ran down our public housing. I understand there's lots of issues with governments managing housing. Other countries do it, right? They do quite a bit more of it than we do. So, you know, less than 5% of the housing sector in public housing just seems a little too low to me. So that's one of the solutions, right? And there would be some single mothers who would be eligible, you would think, for that housing, right? So that's part of that direct problem. If we tax assets a little more, then we kind of force what you might think of as, in some ways, uneconomic investments in housing out into more productive investment. If we tax vacant land a bit more, which, you know, there are now some attempts to do, combined with planning and regulation that would force better use of land, right? Force urbanisation. So the tax system, I think, itself can't really just solve that problem. No one's asked me about negative gearing, but in the last second I'll give my 2 cents on that. Many economists will tell you negative gearing is not a tax concession, which is true. It's just the deductibility of interest and your costs on an income-producing asset. However, it's still a bad idea. And most countries constrain the use of investment losses and interest deductions. They don't do it because they think they're trying to be pure and this is somehow the wrong tax system. They do it because of planning and gaming in the system. So it's just one of those rough justice things that I think we have the setting wrong. And I would like to constrain rental losses and other investment losses and interest, because we can leverage as much as we want, right? If we have assets, we want to control that. Why should we all pay the cost of someone leveraging up an asset, right? So they should be constrained a bit. So I would constrain negative gearing and tax capital gain a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Can we
very
all
much,
give
Sarah.
a round of applause to Miranda? Thank you. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
I will just wrap us up. So thank you all for coming today. That was an incredible presentation. I'm sure there's many more questions that people will want to ask you. And thank you for reminding us, although it is simple, that we can't talk about tax without talking about the transfer system. Catherine James from the Community Tax Project talks about tax as our way of showing solidarity to each other. That has sat with me since she said it, since I first heard it a couple of weeks ago, and I think that that is where it is. And also that a policy can be brilliant, but if it doesn't have the other things, some of the things we discussed in this room when we had Jenny Macklin come and speak about her most recent book on what makes good policy, if it doesn't have some of those other things that might not be the real meat of the policy, but what makes it stick, then it can be the best thing in the world and it won't get up, and it might be years and years before we're allowed to talk about it again. So thank you for that. Next month, we are still locking in our speakers for the rest of the year, so we will email you on that. But please stay in touch with Per Capita, as you all do, via our newsletters. We're doing some incredible work in housing at the moment, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that with you soon. And until next time, thank you again for joining us, and one more round of applause for our wonderful speakers.